everybody, and welcome to the Marley Bird YouTube channel. In this video, I'm answering your questions. You guys have been diligently sending me questions about topics you want me to do videos about. And one of the top questions is gauge. Do I really have to do a gauge swatch? How do I calculate a gauge swatch? What is the importance of a gauge swatch? So I figured I'd go ahead and take this opportunity to do a little video and show you guys how to measure a crochet gauge swatch, how to calculate so that you know how many stitches per inch and how many rows per inch you're getting, and talk to you a little bit about the importance of a gauge swatch, okay? So I'm going to jump on in right now. Go ahead, go grab all of your swatches that you've already done up that you need to get your gauge measurements for, and follow along with me, and I'm going to help you figure out how to get how many stitches per inch and how many rows per inch, okay? Okay, so you have your swatches. I'm going to begin by doing a basic measurement of a double crochet swatch. So look down here, we're going to do that right away. Right here, I have a swatch that I've done that is 30 double crochets across and 13 double crochet rows high. Now, the reason I know exactly how many rows and how many stitches, of course, is because I've counted, but it's also important because I am not going to measure specifically just 4 inches. I'm going to measure across my entire swatch, both directions, and I'm going to take the full measurement and divide it by the number of stitches and the number of rows, so that way I get the right stitch count and row count that I need, okay? Or count, maybe not the right word, the right gauge, okay? If you can see over here on my iPad, I've already typed up stitches divided by inches, and I've typed up rows divided by inches. What that's going to do is that's your clue of, okay, once we know how many stitches we have, we need to measure it and figure out how many inches we have, and that's going to let us know how many stitches per inch we have once we divide that. So I just told you that I have 30 stitches, so I'm going to go ahead and type in there 30 stitches, and I'm going to divide that by how many inches. Let's figure that out. I have my tape measure right here, and I'm going to measure it from right outside here to the outside edge, come across, and I have 8.5 inches, 8.5 inches, okay? Now it is important that you measure that half inch or that quarter inch, okay? Especially if you're doing garments, because those are very important numbers. So I have 30 divided by 8.5. So I'm gonna do 8.5 because that's what it would be, right? And then I do the equal sign and figure out what that is. So if I come over here to my calculator, I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna take 30 divided by 8.5, and that gives me 3.529, okay? I always try and write down the numbers when I'm dealing with garments or anything like that down to the third number from the decimal, okay? That's the thousandth. So I would put 3.529. If I were putting this down in a pattern, most likely I would put 3.5, okay? Unless I wanted to make sure that, you know what, I don't want you to fudge on the side of getting accidentally 3.4 or something like that. I might put 3.6, but typically I'd put 3.5, okay? But for here, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna do 3.529, just so that I have a good base to figure things out for, okay? So now I have 3.529. What does that number represent? I don't know about you guys, but when I was in math class, I always got in trouble for never saying what my numbers were. So I would write, okay, my answer is 5. And it was like, 5 what? 5 elephants? You know, what is it? So right here, our answer is 3.529 stitches per inch, meaning we are getting 3.529 stitches per inch, okay? So I'm going to write in here, stitches per inch. I know, it's shocking. It's so shocking. Somebody dropped keys in the back of the room. All right, so now I know how many stitches per inch I have on this gauge swatch. Now I need to know how many rows per inch. Now some of you might be saying, why do I need to know how many rows per inch? Well, if you're making a garment and it says that you need to work X number of rows till you get to the armpit, and your rows happen to be too small or too large, all of a sudden your piece is no longer going to fit. So you need to make sure that your row gauge, your rows per inch, are the same as what the pattern calls for. So if you remember, I said I had 13 rows, so I can go ahead on here and I have 13 rows, and I'm going to divide that by the inches. So if I measure this out, I'm going to put that there. I have 13, 6 inches, pretty easy. So I'm going to put the number 6 and then equal sign. So I have 13 divided by 6. Come over here to my calculator. 13 divided by 6. So I'm getting 2.15, or not 15, sorry, obviously I can't read. 2.16666, and it goes 6 on forever, rows per inch. So I would put on here on my little sheet 2.166, and once again I want to label what that is, rows per inch. Okay, so now I know that my gauge swatch here, and I used a size I crochet hook, and this is Red Heart soft yarn, and when I do 30 double crochets across, 30 rows tall, I am getting 3.529 stitches per inch and 2.166 rows per inch. So if that is equal to what my pattern calls for, I'm ready. I can pick up my hook, get my yarn, and start on my merry way. If that means that my stitches are too small or my stitches are too big, I need to adjust my hook size, okay? So let's say that all of a sudden my stitches are going to be bigger than this, all right? So let's set this aside and let's bring another one in right here. We have another one. This one is also 30 stitches across and 13 rows high, but we're going to get a different stitch gauge and row gauge because I know for a fact this one is bigger. So let's do this one. Let's see if we can change our color of our the writing. I think we can. I'm not really sure how. Okay, maybe blue. Let's try that. Okay, so I have 30 rows, or 30 stitches, I mean. It's not changing color, but so you guys are good. You know how this works. 30 stitches divided by, we need to know how many inches per inch or per stitch. So we're going to measure all the way across. So I'm starting here. Oh, look at that. I'm at 8 3/4. 8 3/4. So that means I divide by 8.75. And then I need to figure out what that equals. So over here, my trusty calculator, 30 divided by 8.75, 3.428, okay? Okay, so you're getting 3.428 stitches per inch, which means that in every inch, we're getting fewer number of stitches, okay? So what that means is if we started off with 30 double crochets and we did that over 8 inches, just like this one, remember this one was like 8.5 inches, okay? And we did it even more, we're always going to get this little 1/4 of an inch extra, okay? That is important, especially when you're talking about garments, when the size of the garment is something, you know, anywhere from 36 inches to 65 inches. We're talking about bigger numbers here, where this little bit extra would make a big difference. So it's important that you do know that it is 3.428 instead of 3.529. Does that make sense? We want to know that there's a difference like that. And we're going to find the same results when it comes to the height. It's going to be a subtle difference, but there's going to be a difference. We do have 13 rows here as well. So we have 13 rows, and we're going to divide that by how many inches? I come over here, and it looks like it's 6 1/4. So we have 6.25 inches equals, trusty little calculator, 13 divided by 6.25 inches, 2.08. So 2.08 rows per inch. Now, once again, it might not seem like it's very much, but when we're talking about garments, every little 1/4 inch or 1/4 stitch counts, okay? You want to make sure you calculate for all of those. Now, this is really important when we're talking about substituting yarn, and I've done a video regarding substituting yarns where you do a gauge swatch in the gauge you actually want, and maybe do some gauge swatches with the yarns and see if they just match up visually without using a measuring tape. But let's take a look here at one actually using a measuring tape. So if these are some gauge swatches we're doing, and maybe we're trying to reach this gauge measurement, and then we've done another one here, oh man, we know that one's going to be even smaller. So let's see what this gauge swatch is. Let's take a look. First off, I'm going to lay it out flat. And I'm going to, again, this is 30 stitches across and 13 rows. So I'm going to come up here and I am going to start off by writing it's 30 and divided by how many inches. So if I put my tape measure right there and I come across, I am at 7.5. So 7.5 inches. It's a whole inch difference, you guys. Same hook, different yarn, same stitch pattern. It's a whole inch difference. Okay, so that is 7.5 and that equals, so over here we have 30 double crochet divided by 7.5 inches. So it's 4 stitches per inch. Okay, that's a whole half of a stitch, right? Half a stitch? It's a half a stitch difference. When we're talking about garments, figure that one out, right? 36 inches around and you're a full half a stitch off for every inch. I mean, your garment's never gonna fit. So it's very important that you do the gauge swatches to make sure that things fit. We can do the same thing when it comes to rows. I can measure this out. And we were at, it's 5.5. 5.5. So we were at 6 and then 6.25, and now we're at 5.5. Whoa, why is there a bunch of different numbers there? I want to go down there. Return. That's funny. Okay, so it's 13 divided by 5.5, and that will give us, cancel, 13 divided by 5.5, 2.363. 2.363. So it will take us even more rows to get the same measurement, okay? Because our rows are smaller than these rows. And again, I would have to write on here rows per inch. All right, so this is how you would do this. All right, so this is how you would calculate gauge for stitches that are just this simple as a plain stitch pattern, back and forth and up and down. But what if you're dealing with a pattern stitch that is more than just a basic double crochet or basic single crochet? Join me back here. I'm going to show you how to measure across something that has a pattern stitch to it, okay? All right, so we've talked about how to measure across a gauge swatch that is just made up of double crochets. And that would work once again with singles, trebles, anything like that where it's a single stitch working across, okay? But what if you're dealing with a stitch pattern where it's a multiple of doubles and some singles and maybe a couple chains work together, and that creates a stitch pattern? And same thing when it comes to the rows. How do you measure that out? Well, look down here. I'm going to show you how that works. Okay, so if we look down here, I have a simple pattern stitch swatch, and this is the Blushing Shells pattern stitch. It's actually a free pattern over at redheart.com. I'll put a link to it down in the video notes. But what I've done is I decided that I was going to change up the yarn and the hook size, and instead of doing 6 repeats wide, I did 3 repeats wide. And maybe I want to tell people, okay, this is the gauge I got when I changed up the yarn and the hook size. So how would I figure out the gauge? Well, when I'm dealing with a stitch pattern like this, I'm dealing with actual stitch patterns. It's no longer like X number of stitches equals X number of rows. It's this stitch pattern equals how many inches, okay? And when we talk about things like this, it's okay, I'm gonna have 17 stitch patterns wide and that will equal how many inches? Or conversely, when we figure out, okay, I need about 17 inches wide, how many stitch patterns is that going to be? So we're going to change this up a little bit, and we know that we have 3 stitch patterns, but how many inches are each stitch pattern? So you can see here in on the iPad, I have 1 stitch pattern repeat is equal to how many inches divided by the stitch pattern repeats, and that will give us a number that will tell us exactly how many how big a stitch pattern repeat is. So let's jump back a little bit. What is a stitch pattern repeat? Okay, you can see here that these stitches are a combination of double crochet, some shells, a single crochet. There's a bunch of different stitches going on here. So instead of saying, okay, I have 30 stitches across, that really doesn't mean anything because we're dealing with stitches that form a particular pattern. And in this example, these particular stitches form a pattern. I'm going to use these as like a block off, okay? So if I say that's the end of a stitch pattern, and there's the beginning, and going from that side, maybe it goes to that side, everything that's within this little square is the stitch pattern repeat. So that's the stitch pattern repeat and the row pattern repeat. So we need to know how many there are and what are their measurements. Well, we know we have 3 because I just told you that, but also I can see on here, here's 1, here's 2, here's 3. But how big are they? So that's what we're going to figure out. So we have 3 stitch pattern repeats, and if I pull out my measuring tape, I can see that it is 7 inches wide. Okay, 7 inches wide. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to start filling in the blank. So for one stitch pattern repeat, how big is it? Well, we know that we have 3 of them and they are 7 inches. So we're going to go, we have 7 inches and we're going to divide that by 3. And that is going to give us what? So I'm going to come over here to my trusty calculator as it pops on. You saw my lovely husband there. And it goes 7 divided by 3. We have 2.33333. So each stitch pattern repeat is 2.33333 inches. So I can put on here, it equals 2.333 inches. So now we know what each stitch pattern repeat equals. If we wanted to go further and say, okay, we know that each stitch pattern equals that, and maybe we want something that's 20 inches across, so we would go 20 and we would divide that by 2.333, okay? So we'll come over here, we have 20 divided by 2.333. It would tell us that we would need about 8.57 stitch pattern repeats. Well, it's impossible to do 8.57, but we could figure out how to do 8.5, or better yet, maybe we just round it down to 8 pattern repeats or round it up to 9 pattern repeats. So that's what a designer typically will do. We'll just say, okay, these are my rough measurements that I want to go for. It's 20. But if I do that, my stitch pattern repeat doesn't work. So maybe I tweak this and I go ahead and I do 9 stitch pattern repeats and I let that bump up so it's a little bit more than 20 inches. Or I do 8 stitch pattern repeats and it goes down a little bit less than 20 inches. That's what a pattern designer typically will go through. That's why this information is so important when you're dealing with stitch pattern repeats, because you can't very easily break these up. You usually have to work with these as singular units. Sometimes you can work with halves, but you can't work with, typically thirds or anything like that. You want to get a full pattern repeat. So that's how you would figure that out. That's a little bit further than anything you really need to know when it comes to gauge. You really need to know if the pattern says that 3 stitch pattern repeats wide equals 7 inches, you need to make sure that you're getting that 7 inches. And you would do the same thing when it comes to rows. You don't have to really deal with a whole lot. You would say maybe this is a 4-row repeat and it measures X number of inches. You would carry on and do that. Now, we've talked about stitch pattern repeats, but what about motifs? If you're dealing with motifs, how do you measure those to find out what their gauge is? Well, go ahead and join me back here. I'm going to show you one more example of how we would do a gauge for a motif. All right, so we figured out how to work with single, double crochets, treble crochets, whatnot, and measuring those. We talked about stitch pattern repeats. Now let's talk about motifs. Motifs are a different animal in and of themselves. They come in many different shapes and sizes, and it's important to know what the motif size is supposed to be for your particular pattern you're following, because as those motifs are joined together and put together for the full size of your garment or your blankets or whatever it may be, that's what's going to give you, obviously, your finished object. If a pattern calls for a square like this to be 7 inches and you do your square and you're only getting 4 inches, obviously your blanket is going to be completely smaller than the size that is given in the example. So it's important to understand how you measure the motifs. For this, I've done a basic square motif with a granny square in the middle. And I've done, believe it or not, these are squares with a circular motif in the middle that have been built up to be granny squares on the outside. They're both squares, so they're still both going to be measured the same, and they both use the same hook, and they both are granny squares, but because their construction is different, they're going to come out to different measurements, I think. So let's take a look. With this one over here, I can see, as we just did, we are just, if I move in a little bit, it's just a little bit larger than 4. It's about 4 1/4. But it will also depend on how I'm joining these to know how big they're going to be. So that's in something, it's one of those things you'd want to make note of, okay? If you're making something like a garment. If it's a blanket, usually you're about okay. You can measure the opposite way as well. And again, I'm getting 4 inches, okay? When I come over here and I measure across, oh man, look at that. It's 3 1/2, right? Come this way, and it looks like it's about 3 and am I on there right? Let me see. It looks like it's a little bit more than 3 1/2, okay? And that's just because I haven't joined it yet. The way these joins are worked, it sinks it in a little bit. Not that important when you're dealing with the blanket. If you were dealing with a garment, it would be a little bit more important. So then I would say, do a couple swatches, couple of the motifs, join them together in the manner that they need to be joined, and measure those. So if I go across this whole thing, now I'm at maybe 7 1 2 3/4. No, that's not right. It's a little bit more than 7 1/4. So I'm gonna get 7 3/8. I guess 7 3/8, and that, if I do that, so let's do 7.38 divided by 2, so that makes each one 3.69. So each one of my motifs is 3.69, which before, remember I said that I was getting about a little bit more than 7 1/2, and it is. It's about 7 1/4 this way, and about 7 1/4, or not 7, geez Louise, 3 1/4 that way. So that makes a lot of sense, all right? So if you do them where you have the motifs joined together in the manner you're going to join them, I like to measure my motifs like that. Having said that, most of the time a pattern will give you what one motif measures, so you can just, figure that out. If you're going to go ahead and do 2 motifs wide, just multiply what, if it's supposed to be 5 inches and you put it together and you have 10 inches, Bob's your uncle, you have it, you're good to go. So that's how you measure a motif. There's really not a whole lot to it, a lot different. It's very intuitive. You've got this figured out. If it says that a pattern is 4 by 4 and you have a square, you just measure it, it's 4 by 4. Pretty simple. You got this down pretty good. Same rule applies if you're dealing with a garment. You want to have these as close to perfect as possible because you're dealing with larger sizes than just something that's real nice and small like this where it's off 1/4 of an inch. By the time you magnify that, up to 40 inches or whatever it may be, it could really be off and your garment will no longer fit. Oh, that's a lot of information about gauges, isn't it? Hopefully it helped you out a little bit and I wasn't too confusing when it came to math. I know that I struggle a little bit with math. If you have taken any of my craftsy classes, the curvy knits or the curvy crochet class, you know that I mention that a lot. It's been a learning process for me ever since high school. You take math and it's a mandatory course. Then all of a sudden I'm in this design career where I use math all the time and I'm always second guessing myself and always double checking. So even if you go and you do these math calculations and maybe they aren't working for you, do them a couple times, have somebody else check them out. Or if you have a 6th grader or a 7th grader or an 8th grader in your life who is dealing with geometry, go ahead and have them check it out as well. My daughter is waving at me from behind the camera saying, I'm going to look at your math, Mom. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video and I've answered your questions regarding how to take your gauge and why it's important. It's important because you want your stuff to fit and you want your stuff to not be a king size blanket when you're trying to make a twin size blanket or a crib blanket. It's important to know what those measurements are because the pattern, when it gives you a gauge measurement, that's what the designer that's what the designer used to get the object that you like so much. So you want to make sure that you're getting those measurements as well. So even though you might not like a gauge swatch and you feel like it's a waste of time, trust me, it's so much easier to work up a little swatch like this than to finish an entire garment and not have it fit. I'm Marley Bird, and this is the Marley Bird YouTube channel. If you like what you've seen today, please hit subscribe so that you are up to date whenever there's a new video released. Or as my kids say, please smash that like button. I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.